Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. Okay, so in the last 3 weeks we've been considering the field of epistemology. How do we know things? How do we, what is knowledge? How do we justify knowledge? What is truth? And questions like that. Last week we talked quite a bit about the challenges to the idea of knowledge and challenges to the idea of truth and what truth is and that sort of thing. We talked about skepticism. We talked about postmodernism. And then we spent some time talking about how do we know that Christianity is true. And we talked about how we have access to certain evidence base that the non-Christian also has, but then we also saw that we have access to something else the non-believer doesn't have. That is, we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and we looked at the role of the Holy Spirit in confirming to us the truth of Christianity. So that was epistemology, which is, as I mentioned previously, is a category within the field of philosophy. Now, we want to leave our module on epistemology and branch out more widely into a number of questions that fall in the field of philosophy. And particularly in this week and next week, we want to think about how we reason, how we argue, and logic and the rules of logic and that sort of thing. So that's what we're going to do. And today primarily we're going to focus on the field of what's called argumentation. Okay? And when we use the word argument, people may think about a couple different things, and so we need to clarify what we're talking about. So in the first place, oftentimes if we say somebody had an argument or I had an argument with somebody, what we typically mean is that we've had some kind of an exchange of opposing views. And usually it implies the idea of kind of a heated discussion, a heated debate, very passionate debate, or a very passionate interchange over opposing views. Okay? But there's another way that we use the word argument, and that's a noun that just refers to a set of reasons that we may have, or a process that we go through to persuade somebody of something. So you have some reason, or you have a set of reasons that you've assembled together in a certain way that you share with people in the hopes of persuading them of your position. You might use it in any area. You might use it at work to persuade somebody to do things in a certain way. You might use it at home to discuss who needs to do the dishes or take out the trash. You may use it in a political discussion, in debating certain policies or certain candidates, and of course we use it oftentimes when we're talking with people about the Christian faith. So that's what we mean by argument, and that's the way we'll be using the term throughout. Today we'll be using the term that way, and pretty much through the entire this entire class on apologetics. When I'm talking about an argument, typically that's what I'm referring to. So the question then comes up, why would we in an apologetics class need to even think about this issue of argument and the kind of arguments that we have? Again, thinking of it in the second sense, and I can think of several reasons. First, of course, might come to our mind is that if we understand arguments and how arguments work and what makes a good argument and what doesn't make a good argument, it will help us to evaluate the arguments that other people are making to us for maybe their skepticism or their doubts or their questions about various aspects of the Christian faith, okay? Of course, it would apply in many other areas, as I just mentioned, as we're thinking too. But it helps us to evaluate the other person's position and the reasons that the other person has for what they believe or for what they're trying to persuade us of, all right? But I think even more importantly for us as Christians is it also helps us to do a better job of assessing the quality of our own argument, the quality of our own reasoning. How well are we reasoning when we talk to others, when we're trying to convince them of the validity of the Christian faith? And three things come to mind here. One is if we have a well-reasoned argument, if when we make an argument for something in the Christian faith, if we have a well-reasoned argument, that enhances our persuasiveness, right? It makes us more persuasive, particularly to people who are careful thinkers when we're talking to them. If our arguments are well structured and have solid content and that sort of thing, it's going to make us more persuasive. On the other hand, if we get sloppy in the way we reason, the way we try to persuade people in the arguments that we give, either in the way we structure the argument or in the content of our arguments, if we get sloppy, it's obviously it's going to defeat our objective. Okay, it's going to tend, at least to thinking people, it's going to tend to make us less persuasive. So if we're trying to share with them about the existence of God, or we're trying to convince them of the reliability of the Scriptures, or we're trying to talk to them, say, about the miracles of Jesus or the resurrection or something like that, if our arguments are not well reasoned, they're going to pick up on that and they're not going to be persuaded. Okay? And then on a broader level, if someone who's not a Christian, if every time they talk to you or to me about Christianity, and I'm trying to, if they notice that every time I try to persuade them, I'm using poor arguments, or if maybe that's just their experience with Christians in general, that just whenever they talk to Christians, they don't get arguments that are well done, okay? What that's going to do is that's going to increase people's skepticism generally. So not only am I going to fail to persuade them on the particular point I'm talking about, which is the second point there, but on a broader level, if that tends to be their experience with me or their experience with Christians in general, it's going to tend over a period of time to just make them more and more skeptical about Christianity, because they're going to think, well, they don't have any good answers, they don't have any good reasons, they don't have any good arguments for their faith, and they're going to become increasingly skeptical. And so it's important that we take some time, particularly here at the beginning of our year in apologetics, to think through this area of argumentation, how we argue. So some of this will be familiar to you possibly from your time in school. Maybe back in high school or in junior high school, maybe from a math class or perhaps in some kind of logic class you might have taken, or whatever. Some of this stuff may be familiar to you, but for others it may not be as familiar. And of course, we all could afford to take some time to refresh our minds in these areas. But there are primarily three ways that people reason, or three ways people structure their arguments, okay? And the first is called deductive reasoning, okay? You probably remember this term if you took something like this in school. And in deductive reasons, there's a couple characteristics. One is that usually, not always, but usually in a deductive argument, the argument proceeds from the general to the specific. Okay, so it it asserts something, or it makes a premise about a general category, and then it looks at a specific situation to see if that fits within that category, and makes some assessment of that specific situation. So generally speaking, it's arguing, pardon the pun here, but it's arguing from the general to the specific. Okay? The second aspect, and this is true in all deductive arguments, if they're valid deductive argument, all deductive arguments are structured in such a way that the conclusion of the argument follows necessarily from the premises. So given whatever the premises are, now the premises may be true or false, whatever, that's another question, but whatever your premises are, whether you have 2 or 3 or 5 premises or whatever your premises are, in a deductive argument, the conclusion must follow from those premises. The conclusion must be true if the premises are true. Okay? And then the second kind of reasoning is what's called inductive reasoning, or an inductive argument. We'll go over these each in detail more here in a minute. I just want to give you a quick overview first. So in inductive reasoning, the process is kind of the reverse of deductive reasoning. So in deductive, we were arguing from the general to the specific, but in inductive reasoning, we're reasoning from the specific, or more often from a collection of specifics, to the general. In other words, we're looking at specific situations and we're extrapolating from that some general conclusion. All right? The second thing about the inductive argument is, whereas in the deductive argument the conclusion follows necessarily, it's a necessary conclusion given the premises, in an inductive argument the conclusion is probable given the premises. So you have the premises, whatever they are, and so just taking the premises as a given, the conclusion of the inductive argument is probable, but it's not necessary like it is in an a deductive argument. And then the third type of argument is what's called an abductive, or some people call it an adductive inference or abductive reasoning. Okay? And what's done in what abductive reasoning is used for is it's used to try to infer the past cause of something that we observe today. So we look at something today, or some data that we have, some evidence that we have, and we try and figure out what caused that. Okay? And abductive reasoning is a means by which we can look at and assess the data we have now to determine what happened in the past. Okay? And again, the conclusion is probable or possible given the premises. Okay? So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine what is the best possible explanation from the past to explain what we have later or have now. Okay? So let's take some time and let's look at each one of these in more depth. Okay? So first, deductive reasoning. And again, as I mentioned, it argues from the general to the specific. All right? And an illustration of this would be the classic syllogism. You've probably heard this many times before. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And I want you to notice that we've argued from the general category of all men, okay, and we have said that all men are mortal. Then the question is, where does Socrates fit into this? What can we know about Socrates as a specific, okay? Well, we know that Socrates is a man. He fits into this general category, this large category of men. He fits in that. And since all men, everyone in that category is mortal, and Socrates is in that category, that large category, then specifically about Socrates we know that he is also mortal. Okay? And you'll notice that that the conclusion follows necessarily. In other words, given the premises, all men are mortal. Now, maybe they aren't, but given the premise, and given the premise that Socrates is a man, maybe he's not, maybe he's a ghost, but given the premises that he's a man, then necessarily he is mortal, given the premises. Okay? So, oftentimes we talk about, well, this is a valid argument, or that's not a valid argument, that's an invalid argument, that sort of thing. And oftentimes people use those words in kind of a generic sense, or kind of a not a very precise definition. But in the field of logic and in the field of philosophy, when someone's talking about something being valid or being invalid, they have something specific in mind that they're talking about. So in a deductive argument, okay, for something to be what we call formally valid, the conclusion must follow necessarily from the premises. So if, by definition, a deductive argument is an argument in which the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, then by definition, for a deductive argument to be a valid deductive argument, it has to meet that stipulation. The conclusion has to follow necessarily from the premises. Now, I've got that word formally in there because there's an issue about informality that we'll talk about more next week. So, given the premises, the conclusion is necessary. So, in a deductive argument, if you can establish that the premises are true and it's a valid deductive argument, then you know the conclusion is true. Okay? So, then what is an invalid argument? Well, again, I'm talking about formally invalid. So when I'm talking about formal or informal, and again, we'll go into this more next week, we're talking about the structure of the argument, the way the argument is structured. So is the argument structured in such a way that the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, okay? If it's formally invalid, the argument is one in which the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. So if you have an argument that's been structured ostensibly as a deductive argument, but the conclusion doesn't follow necessarily from the premises, that argument would be invalid. Okay? Now, we've said nothing about the truthfulness of the premises or the truthfulness of the conclusion. The only question is, does the conclusion follow necessarily from the premises that we have? Okay? So there's that question. There's the question of valid versus invalid, but there's also the question of an argument being sound or being unsound. And this is a different issue than validity or invalidity. Okay? So when we're talking about an argument being a deductive argument being sound, a deductive argument is sound if it meets two stipulations. And the first stipulation is that it has to be valid. Okay, so somebody's giving you an argument, they're presenting it to you as a deductive argument. If the argument is sound, it will be valid. In other words, the conclusion will follow necessarily from the premises. We'll see some illustrations of this kind of thing here in a moment. But it also has to meet a second criteria to be a sound argument. And that is that all of its premises must be true. Okay? So, for an argument to be valid, the conclusion just needs to follow necessarily from the premise. But it may not be a sound argument, because it only meets the first criteria. It's a sound argument if it is valid and the premises are true. Then it becomes a sound argument. Or you might say, perhaps you might say, a good argument. All right? So, it's possible for us to have an invalid argument with true premises and a true conclusion. So you can have true premises and you can have a conclusion that's true, but the argument still be unsound. All right? So, for example, all popes live in the Vatican. Now, maybe they do or maybe they don't, but this is the premise, okay, that I'm giving you. And, of course, in history there's been a few popes who didn't, but generally speaking, all popes live in the Vatican, so we're going to just accept that as a true premise, although you could probably find some exceptions, all right? Premise number 2, Francis lives in the Vatican, all right? And premise or conclusion then, therefore Francis is the Pope. So my argument is all popes live in the Vatican and Francis lives in the Vatican, therefore Francis is the Pope. Well, what's wrong with this? Premise number 1 is true. Premise number 2 is true. But the conclusion is true. All right? But it's not a sound argument. Why? Why is it not a sound argument? Well, it's not a sound argument because it's not a valid argument, which is one of the criteria. It has to be valid. And it's not valid because the conclusion does not follow necessarily from the premises. All right? And the reason for that is, well, we say all popes live in the Vatican and Francis lives in the Vatican, but we don't know who else lives in the Vatican. So Francis could be a house cleaner. He could be he could be a butler. I don't know what kind of offices they have, what kind of positions people hold in the Vatican, but he could be a cardinal in the Vatican. He could be somebody else who lives in the Vatican and not be the Pope. So the premises are true, but the conclusion's true, but does not follow necessarily from the premises. We don't have enough information here to make this conclusion. Now, we might add another premise or two and make it a valid argument, but as it stands right now, it's not valid. So the argument is invalid, and so it's unsound. All right? So what would be an illustration then of an unsound argument that's valid? All right? So an example would be, only the Pope lives in the Vatican. 2, second premise, Francis lives in the Vatican. Conclusion, therefore, Francis is the Pope. Now again, the conclusion is true, but it's an unsound argument, even though it's a valid argument. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, but one of the premises is false, right? It's not true that only the Pope lives in the Vatican. Other people live in the Vatican too. So this is a valid argument, but it's an unsound argument. It's not a good argument. Okay? So though the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, therefore the argument is valid, one of the premises is false, and so it is an unsound argument. Okay? So let's think then more, just kind of review then, what constitutes a sound or a good deductive argument? Well, first of all, as we say, it has to be formally valid, that is, it has to be structured in the proper way in the sense that we have been talking about. It also has to be informally valid, and we'll get into this next week. What are some informal logical fallacies? And we'll look at a number of them, and many of them I'm sure you're familiar with. Things like circular reasoning, or straw man arguments, or the genetic argument, or things like that. So there's a number of different logical fallacies, and we'll talk about that next week, that are called informal fallacies. But a formal fallacy has to do with the structure of the argument. All the premises are true, or more plausibly true than false. Okay? So the premises of a sound argument, again, need to be true, but let's think about that for a minute. Really, what we're asking for is just that they be plausibly true, or that they be more plausibly true than the contradiction of them. Okay? So in the premises that we had, Francis lives in the Vatican. Okay? What we want what we want for that argument to be sound is we don't have to prove he lives in the Vatican with 100% certainty. All we need to do is establish that it's more probable that he lives in the Vatican, more plausible to believe that he lives in the Vatican than that he doesn't. Okay? So premises need to only be plausible, not certain. So this brings up this issue of absolute certainty. And we don't have to have absolute certainty to have a good argument, right? We just need to have premises that are more plausibly true than not true. And if they are, then epistemically we should believe them. It's reasonable and we should be expected to believe them if they are more plausibly true than implausible. All right? So what are some important points to keep in mind then? One is an argument may be valid, as we said, and yet not be sound. So if somebody hits you with an argument that's very valid, still that you shouldn't accept it. You should, without examining more closely and examining the premises, right? Second thing, keep in mind is that an invalid or unsound argument is not necessarily evidence that the conclusion is false. So I showed you some unsound arguments in which the conclusion was true, right? So just because someone gives you a lousy argument doesn't mean their conclusion is false. And just because you give somebody else a true an argument and the conclusion is true and you know it's true, it may still be unpersuasive because it's an unsound argument. All right? So let's keep that in mind. And I see this all the time. People making arguments, I see it with Christians, I see it on social media where people are arguing or discussing various points or providing arguments, and oftentimes they'll have what I consider to be a true conclusion, but I just think they've done a lousy job of making their case, okay? So we just need to keep that in mind, and particularly as Christians, all right, we want to make sure that not only are our conclusions true, but that our arguments are sound, right? So like I said, we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we have the testimony of the Holy Spirit. There are certain things we're just absolutely convinced they're true, and so sometimes we start with our conclusion, okay, and then we go back and we just tack on some premises to kind of get us to the conclusion. And it just so happens those premises don't get us there, all right? And thinking people will see that, they'll detect that, they'll know that, and it will undermine our case. So these are just things we need to keep in mind. The second kind of reasoning is inductive reasoning, and as we mentioned, frequently it argues from the specific to the general, and the conclusion, while probable, is not necessary. And I want to point out here, incidentally, that most or virtually all empirical scientific reasoning, okay, so scientific reasoning that's based on empirical evidence, the evidence in the laboratory or whatever, is based on the inductive process. And this will become important when we start looking at the question, various questions, scientific questions and questions about miracles and things like that. We need to keep in mind that all scientific, or certainly most scientific reasoning, empirical scientific reasoning, is inductive in nature. So for example, I've got up here the laws of nature. So oftentimes scientists will talk about the laws of nature, whether it's the law of gravity or various laws of nature, all right? And what we need to keep in mind is that we know about these laws of nature through inductive reasoning, not through deductive reasoning. So what we've done is we've argued from, or the scientists have argued from the specific to the general, and that'll be important moving forward. So an illustration would be, say I have a bag of coins and I reach in and I pull out a penny out of this bag of coins, and it just so happens that I've done this previously 9 previous times, and each time I pulled out a coin it was a penny. So and just picking them at random. So if I have randomly reached into the bag 10 times and pulled out a penny, it would be reasonable to make the conclusion that all of the coins in the bag are pennies, because every time I reach in and pull one out randomly, it turns out to be a penny. But notice the conclusion is probable, it's not certain. It's not necessary. So it's possible there's a dime hidden in there somewhere, or a nickel hidden in there somewhere, all right? But it would be a fair conclusion to reach, had I done this 10 times, to say, you know, I think this bag just got pennies in it, it's all it's got. All right? So that would be an example. Another example comes from Jesus. So Jesus makes the argument at one point. He says, the birds of the air are fed by the Father. So this is a specific case of the birds. And we know that the birds are fed by the Father. And then we look at the lilies, and we see that the lilies are clothed by the Father. So we see we've got two specific cases here where the Father has taken care of the birds and He's taken care of the lilies. And then the third premise in this case is that you are more valuable to the Father than the birds or the lilies. So the Father takes care of the birds, He takes care of the lilies, and you're more favored by the Father. He cares more about you. And so Jesus makes a conclusion, which, because it's an inductive argument, is probably true, which is, therefore the Father will feed and clothe you. Okay? Now, it just so happens that we know, because Jesus is saying this, and because we know of His infallibility and things like that, we can factor in some other things, and we know absolutely this is true, that the Father will feed us and He will clothe us, and we can take that to the bank, so to speak, right? So, but technically speaking, as an argument, not factoring in who's making the argument, then the conclusion is a probable conclusion. It's very probable that the Father is going to take care of you, because in these other specific cases we see that He does. So that's just another example from Scripture of inductive reasoning. So we might ask the question then as to which one of these ways of arguing is the strongest. Before we go on to our third kind of reasoning, given the option of deductive or inductive, which is the strongest, and there are several things to keep in mind here, because as it turns out, you might think that a deductive argument would be stronger because the conclusion is necessary, right? But that's not necessarily the case, and there are several reasons for that. One is the premises that you've got for your deductive argument, for your conclusion. The premises you got, they may be weak premises. They may be kind of uncertain. They're plausibly true, but not overwhelmingly so, okay? So they're not real strong things that somebody would just go, well, yeah, that's just clearly true. They may have to think about it a little bit, okay? So the premises may be weak, they may be somewhat uncertain, and to that degree then, they would make the conclusion, although the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, they may make the conclusion maybe not quite as strong of an argument as you might otherwise think, okay? Secondly, the premises that you've got for your deductive argument, how did you get those premises? How did you arrive at that knowledge or that information? Okay? And oftentimes, the premises that you've arrived at, that you're using in your deductive argument, the way you got to those was through an inductive process, right? So you're using your premises in a deductive argument. But in an argument, the premises are just things you just state, and you want people just to accept them at face value, right? But there are reasons why you believe those premises, and what are the reasons why you believe those premises. And it may be that you arrived at the conclusion that those premises were true through the inductive process. And so in that case, though your argument is a deductive argument, and the conclusion follows necessarily, and the premises appear to be true, so it's a good argument, it's a sound argument, it's still ultimately based kind of on inductive argument. It's kind of the ultimate root is in your premises are inductive reasoning. Okay, so it's kind of maybe this is not the best way to say it, but it's kind of like the weakest link in the chain sort of thing. How can a deductive argument be stronger than the premises if the premises are inductive? Okay, and of course that's assuming, that's even making the assumption that a deductive argument would be stronger than an inductive argument, which is the very thing I'm trying to say is not necessarily the case, right? Then the third point is the premises of an inductive argument. So switching from talking about deductive to talking about inductive now, the premises of an inductive argument may be very strong. So if that's true, if they're very strong and very certain, then that lends weight to the conclusion. So for example, if you have a whole array of specific cases and they're all the same, it's just kind of overwhelming that the conclusion is very probably true. All right. So an example of that would be Newton's law of gravity. Okay, so this is one of the laws of nature. Remember that it was arrived at inductively. And yet we all have tremendous confidence in the laws of nature, and scientists and astronauts and the space program and all kinds of people stake their lives on the truthfulness of Newton's law of gravity and the formula that he came up with. Well, how did he come up with it? He came up with it, as I said, through inductive reasoning. He just watched, you know, he'd drop balls or whatever, and he saw how things fell, and he worked out a formula, and he figured out what is the attraction between bodies, and he figured out a mathematical formula, but he did it through induction, through just simply watching what happened and measuring what happened. That's induction. But it happened so regularly and so consistently that he could say, well, this is a law of gravity. This is the way things operate. Okay? So an inductive argument is not necessarily a weaker kind of argument than a deductive argument. So now let's talk about abductive arguments. One of the interesting things, abductive arguments look very similar to inductive arguments. But what happens with an abductive argument is the way it's structured, it seems to commit what's called a formal logical fallacy. So remember, a formal logical fallacy is one that has to do with the structure of the argument. And an abductive argument looks like it's committing a particular kind of formal logical fallacy called affirming the consequent. Okay? So when you look at an abductive argument, just casually look at it, you might go, oh, wait a minute, this is a logical fallacy here. So let's go back and let's think again about deductive argument. So a valid deductive argument. So our example was, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If we take the words out and we just put letters in, if A, then B, okay? So all men, A, then mortal, B, okay? A, Socrates is a man, therefore B, Socrates is mortal, okay? So if A, then B, A, therefore B. So this is a valid argument. And the A is referred to as the antecedent, and the B is referred to as the consequent. Okay? And a fallacy of affirming the consequent rearranges the structure here. So this would be an example. If A, then B, B, therefore A. Okay? Now that's a fallacy. It's called affirming the consequent. So instead of saying A for the second premise, he said B for the second premise. Okay? So the problem here, the reason this is a fallacy is he says, if A then B, B therefore A, is we know that if A is true, then B follows, that B is true, okay? But we don't know, there may be some other things that also make B true. So C, it may be true that C then B, okay? So it could be that all men are mortal, all right? But that does not preclude the possibility that all dogs are mortal too, right? And so what happens here in the affirming the consequent fallacy is that principle has been ignored, and so the person just assumes, well, if A is true, if B is true, then A has to be true, but that may not be the case, all right? So, all dogs are, all men are mortal, but I can't say that Socrates, because he's mortal, he's a man, because he could also be a dog, all right? So in reversing here A and B on the second premise, I've committed a fallacy, all right? So an example of this would be, if it has rained, then the street will be wet, all right? The street is wet, therefore it has rained. So this has committed the fallacy. And why is it a fallacy? You may see it more clearly here. If it says rain, the street will be wet. The street is wet. Therefore it's rain. But we don't know that. It could also be true if children were playing with sprinklers in the street would be wet. There may be some other cause of B than simply A. There may be, like I said, other causes, and I haven't precluded those in my argument. And so if I just simply see the street is wet, I don't know for sure that it rained. There could have been some other cause. So I can't commit that, or I shouldn't commit this fallacy of affirming the consequent. Now what happens in abductive reasoning is that it's structured so that it looks like it's a fallacy. It looks like it's affirming the consequent, all right? So, but the way it avoids committing the fallacy, if it says, if A, then B, therefore possibly A. So, to use our example, if it has rained in the street, if it has rained, the street will be wet, okay? The street is wet. Therefore, it may have rained. All right? Now I've avoided a fallacy because I've acknowledged the possibility of A being true, but I'm not absolutely certain because there could be some other cause of the street being wet, right? So what do? And like I say, abductive is used primarily in historical type of studies and things like that, looking for causes in the past. So if I have some data now and I'm trying to figure out what caused it in the past, all right, I might go through this process and say, well, if A, then B, well, I do have B, therefore possibly A, but it might also be possibly C or R or Q or whatever, right? So what I then need to do is I need to go through a process, and this is what we do in abductive reasoning. I need to go through a process of figuring out of the various possibilities to explain B, which one is the best explanation, okay? And we'll come back to that in a minute and talk about how we do that. So, as I mentioned, this type of reasoning is frequently employed in historical type questions, okay? So it's employed in forensics, in history, in archaeology, in origin science, like questions like the origin of the species or the origin of the cosmos or intelligent design and things like that. And of course in other fields as well. And the idea is to try to discover what is the most likely cause of the data or the information or the evidence that I have today. So just some examples of questions we would answer using abductive reasoning. Who was the cause of the murdered man's death? Okay, so it's used, like I said, in criminal forensics. What was the cause of the origin of the universe? We see the universe is here and we have certain information about it, and we might ask the question, what caused it? And so looking at the information we have now, we might be able to figure out what was the cause of the universe. Given the pottery shards unearthed, what ancient people lived in that area? Archaeology. What caused the variety of species of biological? We have all these species, how did we get them? Okay, and so we would look at that, and then we would make some suggestions of what might be the possible explanation of this great variety of species. What caused the early church's belief in the resurrection? We read in the data, we read in the historical studies, and we see the various early Christians believed in the resurrection. What caused that? And so we would use abductive reasoning to try to figure that out. Okay? So as I mentioned, one of the steps in abductive reasoning is assessing the various explanations that are offered. So if I look at some evidence and then I say, well, what caused it? And I look back and I say, well, it could have been two things. You know, Joe could have committed the murder, or Bill could have committed the murder. All right? So I have two hypotheses. I have two suggestions, two explanations for the murder. All right? How do I look at those two hypotheses, Joe and Bill, and figure out which one is most likely, which is the most reasonable one? And there are two ways that we do that. Most of us don't do it this way, but the first way is called Bayes' theorem. Okay, and I'll explain that here in just a minute. And the second means is called inference to the best explanation. This is the way most of us try and compare competing hypotheses or competing explanations and figure out which one is true. Most of us use inference to the best explanation, but Bayes' theorem is an option. So I'm going to talk about Bayes' theorem. I'm just going to touch on it briefly. It's pretty hard to get your hand around, or your mind around, I should say. And particularly for those of us who may not be particularly mathematically inclined, it may be difficult. But Bayes' theorem is actually used in a number of fields. I was just reading today how it's used in the field of artificial intelligence and developing artificial intelligence models and things like that. Bayes' theorem is used. It's used in engineering. It's used in a lot of different ways. But it's also used in the field of philosophy. Okay? And the example that I have here is one version of Bayes' theorem. All right? And you look at that and that looks like a bunch of gibberish. But actually, each one of these letters, of course, means something. So for example, the PR just means the probability of. H stands for the hypothesis or the explanation you're trying to evaluate. Evidence, E, the evidence, just stands for the evidence that you have that relates specifically to the question that you're trying to resolve. That vertical line that you see there, you would read that on thee or given thee, okay? And then that little kind of lazy backward L there just simply means not, or negation, or not true, okay? So if I were going to read this formula, I would read it, what is the probability, or the probability of the hypothesis being true, all right, given the evidence that I have? What's the probability this hypothesis would be true given this data that I have, this evidence that I have? Well, that's equal to the probability of the hypothesis just without the evidence. Just what's the probability that John would have committed the murder without the evidence that I have, you know? What's the background information? Well, we know John's a human being. We know that human beings commit murder. There are several things, you know. We know he was an acquaintance of the victim. There may be some background information that we have. What's the probability that John might commit the murder given the background information that we had? Times, what's the probability of the evidence existing if John committed the murder? So if the hypothesis is true, what is the possibility that we would have this evidence if John in fact committed the murder, okay? And we assign numerical quantities to this. I'll explain that in just a minute. And then you'll notice everything in the denominator here, everything before the plus sign, everything to the left of the plus sign in the denominator is identical to what's in the numerator. So the numerator here is represented here, and everything below the line to the left of the plus sign. So whatever quantity or number you come up with here, you bring it down here and put it to the left of the plus sign. Then you add to that the probability of the hypothesis not being true, given the background information, times the probability of the evidence being true, or of having this evidence if the hypothesis wasn't true. So what I'm asking here is, what's the probability that John didn't commit the murder, given the background information that I have about him, times the probability that I would have this kind of evidence if he didn't commit the murder. So if I have, for example, I have testimony that he was seen with the victim moments before the murder, if I have his fingerprints on the knife, okay, what's the probability I would have that evidence if the hypothesis isn't true, if he didn't murder, okay? And I would assign quantities to these various questions, and then I just add here, then divide that number into the numerator, and I would have a probability number. And that's basically how Bayes' theorem works. So an illustration here of how the values might be assessed, the way this is often done, okay, is we assign a number in each one of these places, somewhere between 0 and 1, okay, where 0.5 is kind of neither here nor there, it's equal, okay, and anything below 0.5 is improbable, more improbable the further you get from 0.5, and anything that's more than halfway probable, either or, something that's more than halfway probable, okay, that would be above 0.5, between 0.5 and 1. So for example, I've got the emblem there, less than 0.5. So say you had a 0.4, that's a little bit less than 0.5, and that would be somewhat improbable. But if I had a couple less than signs there, that might be like a 0.2. All right. And similarly the other way. So what I've done here in this formula here is I've said, well, the probability of the hypothesis is kind of either way, just using the background information without the evidence. It's a 0.5. It's either way. Could be not. Okay? But the probability of the evidence, of us having the evidence given the hypothesis, is much greater than 0.5. Okay, so in that case, let's say we put a figure 0.8 in there. So then we have 0.5 times 0.8, which would give us, if you know your math, 0.4. Okay, then we'd bring that 0.4 number down and put it in front of the plus sign, and then we'd have, what's the probability of the hypothesis? I've already established up here it was 0.5, and times the probability of us having the evidence if the hypothesis weren't true. So what's the probability? I'd have the eyewitness testimony, and I'd have the fingerprints on the knife. What's the probability I would have that if he didn't commit the murder? And I might say, well, that's not very possible. That's not very probable. All right. So I might make that a double less than 5. So we might say that's a 0.2. Okay. So. Or let's just say 0.1 to make my math easier, okay, a 0.1, okay? So we have a 0.4 here, we have a 0.4 here, and we have a 0.1 here, all right? If you add the 0.4 and the 0.1, you get 0.5, right? And up here you have a 0.4. So if you divide 0.5 into 0.4, you get 0.8. Okay, 0.8 is very probable, very probable. Okay, so if when I've calculated all that, I come up with a number 0.8, then I would say, well, it's very probable John committed the murder. Okay, now typically forensic police and detectives, they don't use Bayes' theorem, they use inference to the best explanation, but that's just to show you how it's used. Now, you will probably never use it, or you may never use it. But I just wanted to tell you about this way of assessing hypotheses so you'll be familiar with it, because it is used, and it's used in the field of philosophy, and it's used in the area of Christian apologetics, sometimes by some philosophers and some apologists. So if you encounter it, I just wanted you to know what it is, okay? There'll be no test on it, so to speak. Let me put it that way. I just want you to be familiar with it. The other way, and this is the way most of us do it, the way we look at competing hypotheses and try to find out which one is the best one, is using what's called inference to the best explanation. And what we do in inference to the best explanation is we have a number of criteria, and we look at our hypothesis or our explanation, whatever we think is an example of abductive reason, whatever we think is the cause of this evidence that we have today. And we look at a number of different criteria. And typically, there are 6 or 7 criteria that are looked at, and it depends on the individual and how they approach things. But the first is, what is the explanatory scope? So I look at my hypothesis, Jesus rose physically from the dead. That's my hypothesis. But there's another hypothesis out there. The disciples stole the body. Okay, so I have 2 hypotheses. How do I compare these hypotheses to figure out which one is the most reasonable one? And one criteria that I use is explanatory scope, which is just simply how many things does a hypothesis explain. The more it explains, the greater its explanatory scope. So if I look at the physical resurrection of Jesus, and I look at the disciples stole the body, and those are 2 explanations for the empty tomb, which one of those things really explains more things, right? It turns out both of them explain the empty tomb. But there are a number of other things that the resurrection of Jesus explains that disciples stole the body doesn't explain. So in the example that I'm using here, the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead would have greater explanatory scope. Then is the criteria of explanatory power. Is how powerfully does the hypothesis explain the evidence that I have? Is it kind of a weak explanation, or does it really explain it, really account for what happened? The third thing, and this is kind of counterintuitive for some of us, but the third thing is simplicity. And this comes from a guy by the name of Ockham, who several centuries ago came up with what's called Occam's razor, okay? And it's just a principle that in comparing explanations, generally speaking, the more simple explanation is the right explanation, all right? Now, me being the kind of person I am, took me a while to get a handle on this, because I like sometimes to get into complicated and make things complicated, and so it's very easy to think, well, the explanation with more stuff in it would be the better explanation. But as it turns out, that's not true. The better explanation, generally speaking, is the simpler explanation. So an example of that is why we accept the or now we have other evidence, but initially why the heliocentric view of the solar system was accepted over the geocentric view. So the geocentric view was, of course, the view for many, many centuries, was that the planets all revolved around the Earth, right? And then along comes Copernicus, and then a little later Galileo, and they go, well, now, wait a minute, we think that the planets revolve around the sun, heliocentric, all right? And the reason that their view was eventually accepted as being the better explanation, this is, of course, before we had astronauts going to outer space and that sort of thing, but the reason it was accepted is because the math required, the geometry required to explain the motion of the planets was simpler with a heliocentric view than with a geocentric view. All right? And so that was one of the strong arguments for the preference for the heliocentric hypothesis or explanation for the movement of the planets. A fourth criteria is what's called plausibility, and this just means which explanation is the one that is implied by more things that we know are true. So, given the things we do know are true, which one of these hypotheses best fits with what we know is true? So for example, go back to our illustration of the disciples stole the body. Okay, so which is a better explanation and plausibility? Because we know certain things about psychology and things like that, and when you start talking about the psychological dynamics that are involved, the argument the disciples stole the body runs into some real plausibility problems. You go, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't fit psychologically with what we know about people. There's other things too. We'll get into that when we get into our study on the resurrection. The fifth criteria is less ad hoc. Okay? So, fewer new suppositions not already implied. So, in other words, sometimes when somebody's trying to buttress up their argument, they just kind of start pulling things out of thin air and they say, well, maybe this, or maybe that, or maybe this, or maybe that, okay? And they're just kind of pulling things out for which they have no evidence. We say that's ad hoc. So a classic example of this is Richard Dawkins. He's been interviewed in the documentary movie Expelled. He's being interviewed and he's being asked to explain the origin of life on Earth. And he's having a very difficult time explaining the origin of life. And so he's coming up with and finally he comes up with what's called directed panspermia, which is the theory. He says, well, maybe it was some life from outer space seeded life on Earth. Okay, and maybe that's how we got life on Earth, is from it being seeded from outer space by some creatures from outer space. Well, of course, he has no evidence for that. It's just an ad hoc explanation, okay? So the less ad hoc an explanation is, the better it is. All right? The sixth thing is which explanation is in accord with things we know to be true, right? So there are some things we're just pretty confident are true, and which explanation really works best with those things that we know are true and that we can establish are true. And then the seventh criteria is just you take the first six and you ask your two hypotheses, which one works best with these six, and the one that comes out on top, generally speaking, over the total of the six of them, it would be your preferred explanation. And it turns out this is really how you and I reason most of the time. Okay, this is how we think most of the time, right? So that's inference to the best explanation. So quickly, before we wrap it up here, we're running short on time, but the question we could ask is, well, what can I do to improve my reasoning skills? So we've talked about a lot of things that are important that we should be thinking about and taking into consideration. What can I do, not overnight, but over a period of time, what can I do to improve my reasoning skills, my ability to argue well? And this would work. This is important not only, of course, for Christian apologetics, but it's important in in error. If you want to figure out which one of you is going to do the dishes tomorrow night, it might be good to know how to reason well on that, right? So what can I do? Well, there are several things that I think are helpful. And one is just what we've been doing today, is just think carefully about my premises and my conclusions. So if I've got an argument that I'm trying to make with somebody, or I'm trying to persuade somebody, I need, if I have time, we don't always have time. Sometimes we find ourselves at work or whatever, we find ourselves in a discussion with somebody and we walk away and go, oh man, I should have said such and so, right? Well, those situations, they do arise. But if we know there are areas that we're likely to have to defend or explain, or we want to persuade people, and we can think in advance, take some time to think carefully, what are my premises? What are my conclusions? Is this a deductive argument? Is it an inductive argument? Am I using abductive reasoning? And how can I do this well? Okay? So how strongly can I support my premises to a skeptical listener? So I have these premises, and I'm going to start my argument by saying, well, premise one, and I'm going to ask them just to accept those, right? I'm just asking them to accept it at face value that I said it. How good are my premises? How likely are they to accept my premises? Does my conclusion follow logically from my premise, or even in the case of an inductive, or does it follow probably? I should think about that. Thinking carefully about my inductive and my abductive arguments, as well as my deductive arguments. Just thinking these things ahead of time through, like I said, using Bayes' theorem or using inference to the best explanation. Another thing I can do to help improve my reasoning is to read about and listen to opposing arguments. So, for example, in the area of apologetics, there's a lot of debates on YouTube between a Christian apologist, guys like Frank Turek or Wallace or William Lane Craig or John Lennox. There's some of these guys that have debated leading atheists and leading skeptics, and you can go and you can listen and you can hear the opposing views and then hear how they're answered, okay? And that will help you. Or just reading books, and of course you want to be picking your book if you haven't done it already on apologetics that we talked about earlier, and I'll be asking you here in the next few weeks to tell me what book you're going to read. If I talk through my arguments aloud, alone or with another person, okay? So if you can't find somebody that'll listen to you, sometimes you just do it yourself. I do this actually all the time. When I go, whenever I'm going to teach, whether it's an apologetics class or if I'm going to teach a Bible class or a Bible study or whatever, I always kind of go out and get by myself. Oftentimes I go out to the lake in kind of a remote area and get by myself where people aren't going to hear me talking to myself, and I talk through what I'm going to say. Because oftentimes when you say it out loud, you go, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound good. I can hear the opponent say, wait a minute, that's, I don't know about that, okay? So oftentimes just talking through my arguments out loud, either with somebody else or just by myself, will help. And then even writing out your arguments. So if you know you're going to be talking to somebody, you can write, not that you're going to read what you wrote to them, but just writing it out ahead of time helps you think very clearly. So, for example, Francis Bacon has this quote attributed to him. I've kind of paraphrased it here, but essentially what he said is, reading makes for a full man, conversation ready man. It means just being in conversation with people and talking with people makes you more ready to respond, more able to kind of think on your feet, so to speak. And he says writing makes an exact man, okay? Which means just the process of writing something down makes you think very precisely about what you're saying. So these are just some things we can do to help improve our reasoning skills. So next week, now we want to go on, still talking kind of in this area of reasoning and that sort of thing, and we want to talk about the subject of logic. What is logic, and the various fundamental laws of logic and logical fallacies and that sort of thing. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week.